Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to Geert Hofstede's work and his cultural dimensions. In the last episode, we talked about Edward Hall, and although I think his cultural dimensions are very interesting, like we mentioned, low and high context cultures, monochronic versus polychronic time cultures, and the dimension of space and proxemics. I think these are very interesting, and please take a look at the previous episode to learn about these things. However, we're going to focus today and for the next 6 or more episodes on Geert Hofstede's work instead of Hall for basically one main reason. And that's because while Hall and his research is very useful, and we can say, for example, Brazil is a high context culture and the Netherlands is a low context culture, there are no objective figures. There's no scores related to these dimensions. We can just say, this is high, this is low, this country is medium. However, with Geert Hofstede's work, he's done a questionnaire and research compiling hundreds of thousands of respondents and answers to get concrete and objective scores about different cultural dimensions relating to different nations. So what do I mean here? Well, for example, 2 episodes ago, we talked about how Spanish-speaking countries on average are more noisy than English-speaking countries and why that might be. And I mentioned that one of the reasons might be because Spanish-speaking countries like Spain itself are generally high in the dimension uncertainty avoidance. And I gave the statistic that Spain has a score of 86 in uncertainty avoidance. So this is just one example of how we can quantify the dimensions used in Geert Hofstede's work, while in Edward Hall's work, although we can say maybe, Spain is a high context culture, there's no specific scores because there was not a comprehensive study, a comprehensive survey, questionnaires, etc., like there has been with Geert Hofstede's work. So who is Geert Hofstede? Well, he's a famous social psychologist and cultural scholar, a bit like Hall. However, when we mentioned Hall, I told you he was an anthropologist, whereas Hofstede is a cultural psychologist. Well, it's a small difference here, but I guess the point is that Hofstede was working for the famous and well-known company IBM. And during his time there, he did a comprehensive survey of all of the IBM employees in the world. He asked over 100,000 IBM employees many questions related to culture. And through this research, through this questionnaire, he developed the 5 cultural dimensions of Hofstede. Actually, now there's 6, but in the beginning there was 5. And they are power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and more recently, indulgence. So today I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what all these 6 dimensions mean, because that will be the content of the next 6 episodes. However, I would like to tell you now that the reason that we're focusing on Hofstede's work instead of Hall's is because we have some quantitative data about the countries. We can see the score that they received through Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Hofstede's study aimed to compare and contrast cultural aspects and values across many nations. And in this way, it was a great tool to help with communication across cultures. Like I said, Hofstede worked for IBM. So Hofstede's research was initially done to help the IBM management with cross-cultural management and organization. Of course, you don't need to watch this podcast just if you're interested in management or organization. I think it's also very interesting and fun just to know for your own personal interest, if you like to travel, if you have friends from different cultures. Since Hofstede's initial research in the 70s and 80s, these figures have been updated on a regular basis every few years. So when I talk about the score, know that this is not a score that was recorded 50 years ago and hasn't been updated, but that these scores are updated quite often. That's not to say every year, but every few years, maybe 5 years. Nevertheless, it's important to note that just because there is a certain score for each country on certain dimensions, doesn't mean, first of all, that if you're from Spain, that you would rank 78 in uncertainty avoidance, for example. And that doesn't mean that every person in the country is like this. Of course, there's individual differences. And also, we must point out that there might be some inaccuracies due to modern changes, right? If power distance was ranked 5 years ago, maybe now it's slightly different. And of course, there might be some differences between regions in a country or even between towns in a region, right? Another limitation of Hofstede's work that we must address is that, like I said, these questionnaires were given to IBM employees only. So it's not a questionnaire that is given to everybody in the country, only IBM employees. However, IBM employees around the world. And maybe you're thinking, well, if it's only IBM employees, how can I take the research seriously? Well, hold on a second, because the point is, with these dimensions, that if a country scores 50, that means it's an average score, right? So that means compared to the other people in the study, they are average. So it doesn't really matter too much that it's only IBM employees, I don't think, because the point isn't that, IBM employees are a certain kind of people, but rather that there is a control here. So in many experiments, it's important that we control some things in order to see the difference in other things. So in this case, the control is that the people who are answering the questionnaire are all IBM employees. That's the control, right? So instead of having a Japanese construction worker and a London banker, which would be extremely different perhaps, at least there's one control here. That is a Japanese IBM employee and a British IBM employee. So there's one control. So in this way, I think, although it sounds a bit strange, it's only people from this company. The good thing is that we're taking away one variable that could be different, right? So they have a similar job. So that means, I believe, that the results we get are more focused on the country where they're from rather than their job, right? I gave you a definition of culture before, that culture is the way we do things around here. And for me, that's the best definition. But let me give you one more, according to Hofstede. He said that we define culture as the collective mental programming of the human mind, distinguishing one group of people from another. This programming influences patterns of thinking, which are reflected in the meaning people attach to various aspects of life and which become crystallized in the institutions of a society. Well, I have to be honest, I prefer the other definition just because it's so simple and to the point. However, I think it's important that you also hear that definition because after all, we're going to look at Hofstede's dimensions for a while, and it's important to know how they define culture before we start talking about their cultural dimensions. So, what do you think about that? How would you define culture? And in a nutshell, what do you think culture is? One more important note about Hofstede's cultural dimensions before we start looking at each dimension individually. And that's the point that's mentioned on their website, which is that culture can vary more within a country than the average culture of a country versus another. That is to say that the culture of somebody in the UK and another person in the UK, so the individual differences could be bigger than the difference between the national culture of the UK and the national culture of another country, like Spain, maybe Germany, France, etc. So that is to reinforce the idea or the point that these scores that we're going to talk about do not represent everybody in a country, but rather it's the average. Just knowing that Spain has a score of 86 in uncertainty avoidance, for example, we cannot take a score like this and just start explaining things about what that means, but rather this is a tool for comparison. So it's not that Spain has a score of 86, but rather what score does the UK have, or Germany have, or another country have, and how does that compare with Spain? Okay, so when we talk about these scores in the next few episodes, it's always about comparison. Okay, it's not just the score is 30 or the score is 80, but this score is 30 and the other country has a score of 60. So what can we say about the differences between these two cultures, right? So for the next episodes, I'm going to always try to give some comparisons. I'm not going to talk about just one country and say what that means, but rather give an example of maybe 3 or 4 countries, as well as some examples that they give in the research. I will try to give some personal anecdotes. And I hope that you, if you're from this culture, you agree with my explanation and my definition. However, if I say something which you think is wrong, please let me know, because I'm always willing to improve and to set the record straight. So that's it for this episode, and in the next episode we're going to really get started with the first cultural dimension, which is power distance. And I have a few countries, for examples, that I think will be very interesting. See you then. Thank you for listening to and/or watching today's episode. If you heard some magical bells during the episode, that was to notify you that I'm using some key vocabulary. So now, before we finish, let me repeat that key vocabulary with the definitions given. To compile, to organize information from various sources into a book, report, or list. Comprehensive, complete and including everything that is necessary. Anthropologist, someone who studies human customs, beliefs, and relationships. Quantitative, data that can be collected and presented using numbers. To address an issue, to give attention to or deal with an issue or problem. In a nutshell, in brief, presenting just the key points. To reinforce, something that provides proof or support for an idea. Anecdote, a short, often funny story that someone has experienced. And finally, to set the record straight. To write or say something in order to make some updated information known. Thanks guys, if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.